So let's continue with rock deformation and now focus on joints and faults. Now we saw last time that joints and faults are in response to brittle deformation, where rocks near the surface fracture. Okay, joints are cracks or splits in a rock along which no appreciable movement has occurred, such that straight on one side of the joint align with straight on the other side without any offset. For example, this picture shows a series of horizontally layered sedimentary rocks that are cut by vertical fractures. But notice that on both sides of the, there's no offset on either side of the fractures. And here's the actual picture. We see it towards the top, vertical joints, as opposed to horizontal bedding of sandstone and shale. And here's an aerial view of parallel joints. This is in the Navajo sandstone of Utah. And notice how the joints parallel one another. And here's an outcrop of igneous rocks, and we see typically two sets of joints formed from the release of confining pressure as a result of exhumation of this rock. And recall that in the case of sheeting, when the rock was exhumed, it expanded. And this expansion, in turn, produced two sets of joints intersecting at 90 degrees. This is typical of expansion fractures. You get two sets that intersect at 90 degrees. And here we see some columnar joints. This is again Devil's Tower in Wyoming. These particular joints formed when the original magmatic intrusion gradually cooled and solidified, and in so doing developed shrinkage patterns, which we see once the feature was exhumed above the surface. Now faults, on the other hand, a fault is a plane of dislocation where rocks on one side of the fault have moved relative to rocks on the other side. For example, in this photograph, this particular fault is near vertical, and the relative movement of the two blocks are shown by these half arrows. But if we follow one particular layer, we see that when we cross the fault, the layer is offset, and that by definition is what a fault is. And here we see, again, a couple of faults. This particular geologist is quite amazed at these features. But the faults themselves, which are clearly visible in the photograph, follow any one of these rock layers, and we see displacement crossing from one side of the fault to the other. Well, here's a question on relative geologic dating. Did the geologists come before or after the faults? Yeah, the geologist came after the fault because otherwise his head would be offset from the rest of his body. You know, bad joke, never mind. Gosh, tough audience here. So anyway, faults result from brittle deformation in response to any of the three types of stresses: compressional, tensional, shearing stress. However, the type of fault as shown in this figure differs depending upon the type of stress that's exerted. For example, compressional stresses will cause reverse faulting, tensional stresses result in normal faulting, and shearing stresses result in what's called strike-slip faulting. And we'll take a look at these different types of faults in more detail. But the types of faults in general are normal faults, reverse faults, thrust faults, strike-slip faults, and finally we're going to look at what are called oblique faults. Now let's begin with what are called dip-slip faults. Now in dip-slip faults, the movement of blocks is primarily parallel to the overall dip of the fault plane. So here, if you look at these two figures, we see that the fault planes are dipping at an angle to the horizontal, and we can actually measure the dip angle of the faults on the surface. But examples of dip-slip faults include normal faults, reverse faults, and thrust faults. In all cases, the movement of the blocks on both sides of the faults are parallel with the overall direction of dip of the fault. Now, in order to better define these different types of faults, we have to first discuss what's called hanging wall and footwall. Now, a dipping fault plane divides a rock into two blocks. Now, by definition, the hanging wall is the block of rock that occurs above an inclined fault plane. In this case, the fault plane is represented by that ore vein. What happened here was that underground solutions flowed along the fault plane, and in so doing crystallized minerals, ultimately leading to an ore vein, for example, of a copper or gold or so on. And in this cutaway view, we have a miner actually following that ore vein. Now, the hanging wall, by definition, is the block of rock above an inclined fault plane. In other words, from the miner's perspective, it's the rock that occurs above him, that's hanging above him. Okay? On the other hand, the miner is standing on the footwall. The footwall is the block of rock that occurs below an inclined fault plane. So to define both the hanging wall and the footwall, we have to actually look at a cutaway view, a cross-section of the fault, in order to determine which block is which. So is everybody on board with this? Okay. Now, normal faults are the result of tensional stress. Notice in the block diagram that the stress arrows are pulling in opposite directions. And the consequence of this is that the hanging wall slips downward relative to the footwall. So hanging walls are the brittle response to tensional stresses. And this is how rocks respond to this overall type of situation. So let's begin with development of a normal fault. Here we see a block diagram, and we have tensional stresses acting upon this block. And in cross-section, we see the dashed line representing the future location of the normal fault. And over time, as extensional stresses act upon these rocks, the normal fault is activated. And at this point, notice that the footwall rises, whereas the hanging wall drops. And we can even see on the surface the development of what's called a fault scarp. Now, as tensional stresses continue to act over time, the footwall will rise, creating a mountain range, whereas the hanging wall will continue to drop, creating a valley. Now, eventually, faulting is going to stop. And after the cessation of faulting, erosion takes over on the surface, and over time, the mountains will erode down, whereas the valley will fill with sediment. and eventually the fault trace itself will become buried, covered by sediment. Any questions? So here we see a road cut showing a nice normal fault. This is the hanging wall. Again, the block of rock that occurs above the fault plane, and the footwall, which is the block that occurs below the fault plane. And we see by the relative sense of movement that the hanging wall has dropped down relative to the footwall. Okay. Normal faults commonly form in what are called rift valleys. Again, notice that we're looking at extensional stresses working in opposite directions. And the pulling apart of these rocks causes the generation of normal faults. We have two normal faults, and you can convince yourself that both of these faults are normal simply by looking at the relative displacement of the hanging wall versus the footwall. The downfaulted block, by definition, is called a graben, whereas the uplifted blocks are called horsts. So what type of a tectonic, well, let's keep going. Anyway. A good place to see horst and graben type of structures is in the what's called the Basin and Range province of Nevada. And if we look at the lower block diagram, we see that we have a series of grabens separated by horsts. And in cutaway view, we see a series of normal faults which merge into an overall detachment fault that occurs along the base. Notice again that it's extension that's occurring within the basin and range. And in the photograph shown above, the uplifted areas are horst blocks, and the grabens are the valleys that are filled with sediment. Now, unlike tensional stresses, compressional stresses form a different type of a fault called a reverse fault. And the reason it's called reverse is because the blocks are moving in directions opposite to that of normal faulting. In this case, the hanging wall moves upward relative to the footwall. And this would be the type of faulting that would be associated with convergent plate boundaries. So here again is a exposure of a reverse fault with the footwall and the hanging wall. And if you follow the individual strata, you see that the sense of movement is such that the hanging wall has moved up relative to the footwall. Here is a scarp of a reverse fault. This formed as the result of the Armenian earthquake back in 1988. So here we see a geologist measuring the overall vertical displacement along this particular fault. Now, a reverse fault is much like a thrust fault. However, there are some notable differences. Now, for both types, the hanging wall moves upward relative to the footwall. However, there are some notable differences. For example, in the case of reverse faults, the fault angle is generally greater than 45 degrees. Reverse faults also tend to be generally small and accommodate merely local displacements. On the other hand, thrust faults have fault angles less than 45 degrees and in turn can accommodate much larger displacements on scales of tens to hundreds of kilometers. And here we're going to see an example of development of a thrust fault beginning with Precambrian rocks that are overlain by younger Cretaceous rocks. And in cutaway view, cross-section, we see the incipient thrust fault indicated by the red dashed arrows. And again, keep in mind that we're looking at compressional stresses, so we would expect an overall shortening in the horizontal direction and thickening within the vertical direction. Now, with the development of the thrust fault, the hanging wall to the left is moving up and over the foot wall that occurs to the right. And over time, with the shallowing of the fault angle, we get what's called an overthrust fault. So notice in the case of the overthrust fault to the right that the fault angle is near horizontal at this point. And what's more, we now have older rocks of the hanging wall being shoved up and over younger rocks of the foot wall. And this throws the entire principle of superposition on its head. A geologist who would not know that there was a fault there would mistakenly regard the upper rocks as younger than the underlying rocks, but in this case it's older over top of younger. Now, after faulting stops, there's a period afterwards where the hanging wall is removed by erosion. However, we can get a little bit of a relic left behind of the hanging wall, and in fact, if you've ever been to Glacier National Park, Glacier National Park itself consists of Precambrian rock, ancient rocks over 1 billion years old, exposed on the surface as part of the relic hanging wall. On the other hand, if you go a little bit to the east, you encounter what's called Chief Mountain, which sticks up above the landscape. This is a relic of the hanging wall. Most of the rest of the hanging wall has been removed by erosion. I don't know if there's actually a chief on there, but anyway. Any questions? Now, strike-slip faults are quite a bit different. A strike-slip fault is where fault movement is primarily horizontal and parallel to the strike of the fault plane. Strike-slip faults accommodate motion between tectonic plates. Strike-slip motions that accommodate motion between tectonic plates are called transform faults. Examples include the San Andreas Fault of California. But basically, strike-slip faults are the situation where one block just slips horizontally past another block. And this, as we would expect, results from shearing stresses. Usually in the case of strike-slip faults, the fault plane is vertical, and a vertical fault plane will, we won't be able to distinguish a hanging wall from a footwall. Hanging wall and footwall only applies to faults that are at an angle other than 90 degrees. So here is an example of the San Andreas Fault of California. In the upper block diagram, if you look at the drainage, the streams, notice that when you cross the San Andreas Fault, the streams are offset. And if we were to stand on one block, for example, the block to the left, and look across to the block towards the right, notice that the streams are offset towards the left. And now, if we were to do it in the opposite direction, if we stood in the other block and looked across to the block to the left, we would still get that sense of offset to the left. And as a result, by definition, this would be a left lateral strike-slip fault. Okay? Now, not only is the San Andreas a strike-slip fault, it's also a transform fault because it actually accommodates motion between the Pacific and North American plates. Another good example is the Alpine fault of New Zealand, another transform fault that occurs on land. In this case, the Alpine fault accommodates motion between the Australian and the Pacific plate. Now, would this be a left lateral or a right lateral strike-slip fault? Imagine yourself standing on maybe the right block and looking across towards the left block, and what's the sense of displacement to the right or left? Look at the motion arrows. Yeah, it's shifting towards the right, actually. So it would be right lateral strike-slip. And finally, oblique fault, which has both the strike-dip and dip-slip component. Here, if you look at this illustration, notice that there's a vertical component of the slip, and we also have a horizontal component. So the actual angle, this actual slip is in an oblique direction. And oftentimes you find these associated with strike-slip faults that have bends. But for the most part, any questions? Okay, I think we're finished with faults.